Hi there, everyone, and welcome to week 4 of our LinkedIn Live weekly series for the fall. Really excited about doing this series and about all of the amazing things we've got planned over the next several weeks. We have a lot of interesting guests coming, and more are just confirming as we speak. And today, I'm also very happy to have Diana join me, who is here from our firm. Diana is our VP of Operations and Strategy. And basically, we're going to take a bit of time today for Diana to give us some updates on some of the international development sector stuff that's been happening lately, specifically related to global affairs. There have been a few interesting developments over the last few weeks that we wanted to share. As you know, our firm provides government relations support, grant writing support occasionally, and other kinds of consulting support, as well as training. We're on a mission to empower Canadian nonprofit organizations to be more effective in their work with government and to achieve their goals with government, both funding as well as advocacy goals. And we have the privilege in our work of working with many different amazing organizations doing really exciting stuff. And it's great to be able to support them, cheer them on in the background, and give them tips and tools and strategic advice along the way. So part of that, and a big part of the work that we do, of course, is in the international development sector, where both Diana and I worked for, the past 10 to 15 years. And we have a special connection with that sector, although we're interested in the sector more broadly. And so I have Diana here today. Diana, maybe you can also just take a minute to introduce yourself again as well, because I think you've been on here before, but it's been a little while. Maybe just introduce yourself for this fall series, and then we'll dig into a couple of the topics we want to talk about today, one of which is the upcoming call for proposals for the Indo-Pacific region. And the other is an update that Diana can provide, because she attended last week's Ontario Council for International Cooperation meetings, where there was a presentation from the GAC Partnerships ADM, Patricia Pena. So Diana, over to you for introductions.
Great, thanks, Jesse. So as Jesse shared, I am Diana Apostolidis. I work with Jane Clark Consulting as the VP of Strategy and Operations. I've been with the firm now for just over a year. Prior to joining the firm, I worked in the nonprofit sector with a lot of different INGOs. I've always largely worked in the international development sphere. So in roles that have involved government relations in the sense of managing institutional partnerships, managing funding applications for institutional partners, also grants management of government funded grants. So a lot of my experience has been on that front when it comes to government relations. So happy to be here.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Diana. Yeah, and it is very exciting that we're now actually passing Diana's 1-year anniversary with the firm, which is fantastic. Because it's been really, really helpful for me to have you on board, and you've made a huge contribution so far. So just to go into the first piece we wanted to touch base on today, it's quite exciting. We were given a heads up about this by GAC. I guess they announced that back in the summertime in August, that there would be a call coming. The call is now open, and it's the first time in a very long time that I can remember, at least, which goes back quite a while, that there's been a call focused specifically on human rights, access to justice, inclusive governance. And so, and as someone who's worked a lot during the course of my career on human rights, including many, many years ago, was in the human rights and governance team at what was then CEDA at the very beginning. It's exciting to see some funding dedicated to this area, and to see Canada continuing to take leadership in this area. And also exciting to see funding for the Indo-Pacific region, which has not been a main focus of a lot of funding in recent years. So an interesting opportunity. I know it's generated a lot of excitement within the sector. And Diana's done a bit of a deep dive into sort of reading through it and understanding a lot of the different aspects of what GAC is looking for. So she's going to give us a bit of a summary of that. So Diana, over to you in terms of telling us about the call.
Yeah, I think just to share some of the key parameters of this call for proposals. there is 30 million available in funding for projects under this call. There's anticipated 8 to 10 projects, I think, that will be funded with individual budgets between 2 million to 7 million. The other requirement is that these projects need to be 4 years in duration. Some other things that are, very typical, as we've seen with calls for proposals from GAC, there is encouragement to work with a local partner. So that could be a civil society organization, an Indigenous organization, or even a democratic oversight institution partner, which is, very typical. People often know this, that there is a requirement, or not a requirement, but an encouragement to work with local partners in country. Some other things that are kind of interesting about this call, it is sector agnostic. There is no specific kind of sector that's called out. There is, quite an emphasis on human rights and governance, and sort of how that's understood from a policy perspective, I would say, is, looking at the FIAP Action Area 5, which is all about inclusive governance. The other sort of policy guidance is GAC's Indo-Pacific strategy. This is a strategy, a whole of government strategy. I think that's another interesting kind of piece of this, is that this is in support of a strategy for quite a large region, the Indo-Pacific, and it's whole of government. So it's not only looking at development assistance, which is captured under this strategy as, I think, investing and connecting in people. But there's other objectives of this strategy that span a number of ministries. So we have promoting peace and security as sort of one element of this strategy, expanding trade and investment, sustainable green future, Canada as a reliable, engaged partner. There's, quite a strong infusion, I would say, of sort of Canadian values throughout. So that emphasis on human rights, gender equality, women's rights. There's also an element of not only the feminist development assistance policy and the principles of that, but also reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. That comes out in the strategy as well. And it also comes out in this call for proposals. So it's not only Canadian registered civil society organizations that can apply, but they also encourage Indigenous organizations to apply. They also kind of call out working with an Indigenous local partner in sort of the countries that you anticipate working in. So I think that's something important to kind of recognize, that, in addition to the FIAP Action Area 5 around inclusive governance, which has its own sort of particular prioritized interventions that GAC would like to fund under this action area, the wider sort of government strategy of the Indo-Pacific is something, you should also be keeping in mind when you're thinking to apply for this as a Canadian organization working in this region. And I think what I mean by that also is understanding that this whole strategy is about Canadian interests in the region as a government. So, for example, when you're thinking about your geographic selection of where you want to work, I think you can be strategic in that, in terms of where you decide you would want to do some programming or implementation. So one of the things that also comes out in the Indo-Pacific strategy is ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
Asian nations, yes. I've also heard it referred to as ASEAN as well.
ASEAN,
I think.
ASEAN.
Yeah.
That makes a little more sense. Yeah, ASEAN. It's very central in the strategy of wanting to engage more strongly, more intentionally with that organization. So that might be a helpful clue or direction when it comes to where you might want to consider your programs. Some other things about this call, they are asking for projects to be a minimum GE2, which again is not that surprising. At this point, I don't think GAC is funding anything below a GE2. They also provide outcome statements as well that they're asking organizations to align to or adapt based on the proposed projects. So again, something that we've been seeing also more often. I think that was also the case with the health system strengthening call as well. I think the other, key thing to consider if you're thinking to apply for this, are some of the eligibility requirements around project examples or previous experience. So when they refer to sort of recent experience, they're talking about projects that you've managed or implemented within the last 8 years. They're also asking that whatever examples you provide, they demonstrate 5 years of cumulative experience delivering projects under the FIAP Action Area 5 of inclusive governance, and a minimum of 3 of those years in the Indo-Pacific region itself. So this is something I think to keep in mind when you're thinking about your competitiveness for this call. One other thing I think I will share, and it might be jumping a bit to the OCIC event, but as Jesse mentioned at the OCIC symposium last week, Patricia Pena, who is the Assistant Deputy Minister of the Partnerships and Innovations branch at Global Affairs Canada, had a session where it was a bit of a Q&A, and Partnerships is overseeing this call for proposals. They're overseeing this funding, and one of the things that came out of that update that Patricia sort of spoke to was there is a lot of anticipated demand for this funding. They're anticipating likely more demand than what can be provided, more demand than there is funding available.
Mm-hmm.
And a big sort of piece of advice she gave was for organizations to consider consortium type collaborations on this project. In fact, it was highly, highly encouraged. So this is, I think, another helpful tidbit for organizations to consider when thinking to apply for this.
Yeah, and I would say too that it's interesting because everything that I was saying in the introduction here, in terms of, it's unusual to have this kind of focus within an RFP. It's unusual to have both geographically and sectorally, or I'm not sure if we call it a sector, but in any case, have this focus on human rights and governance. It's quite unique. So I think there's also a lot of demand and interest because there's a lot of important work to be done in that region, and $30 million is not a huge amount for this kind of call by any stretch of the imagination. So yeah, I think it's certainly anticipate that it'd be very competitive, and I think that's probably one of the reasons that they're encouraging consortiums is to try and encourage as many, so it makes it a little bit easier on the GAC end for them to evaluate multiple proposals and to make some selections that will cover different organizations in the sector. For sure.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. It's tricky, right? Because it's not a specific sector. It's very much about, I would say, like institutional strengthening, access to justice, inclusive leadership and governance. These are all areas that are quite, they're specific, and it's, not all organizations specialize in this. I think it's also really important that your organization is able to conduct or has access to a really strong human rights analysis in wherever you're thinking to program. The other thing that really comes out too is that I could be wrong. This could be just my interpretation, but they do make mention of having to do a GBA plus analysis at the proposal stage. And when you read through the call, they're very intentional about calling out different sort of identity factors They talk about intersectionality quite a bit in that. And I think it's not going to be enough just to sort of speak to women and girls and their human rights as sort of a broad group. I think it's really important to really understand the different sort of identity factors of marginalized, vulnerable populations that you intend to support, and sort of the barriers and specific sort of human rights violations or abuses that they're experiencing as a unique group. I think that to me comes out strongly as well in the call.
Definitely, yeah, definitely. I think it'll be interesting too, just because it's not a sector where there's been maybe as much attention or focus. Well, or call it a sector or not, but anyway, but given the fact that there hasn't been as much focus on human rights, on strengthening democratic spaces, I would say even maybe over the last decade or more. So I think it's not an area where, like say with a health call or something where generally gender focused, there's tons of organizations that have a lot of experience, right? I think it's harder to find organizations that have, that specific technical expertise and experience. I think it's also, and this for me, this goes back, far back to when I was working in that team at Global Affairs, when we were first promoting the idea of using a rights-based approach and infusing that with RBM. It's exciting to see, I think this is really an opportunity to take that kind of approach and design a project using rights-based language as well. And that would very much fit in with GBA Plus as well, because I think those two approaches are very well aligned. So I think it'll be interesting to see what comes from it in terms of what projects get funded and the impact they're able to have as it moves forward. And we're always happy to get in touch with if anyone has questions or wants to ask anything about this upcoming call. We're not Global Affairs. We're not experts in that sense. But we've, looked at the call, thought about it, and happy to share any insights that we might have as well. So thanks so much for that, Diana. That was really helpful. And feel free to add, to post questions as well if you're watching live, or to send them to us as well by message later on. I'm just going to turn it over and back to you now again to talk about the OCIC meeting you attended, and particularly the ADM's remarks.
Yeah. So last Wednesday, September 27th, was the Ontario Council for International Cooperation, OCIC. It was their annual symposium, and it marked their 35th anniversary as well. For those who are listening and maybe aren't familiar with OCIC, who they are, OCIC is part of the Intercouncil Network, ICN. And the ICN is a coalition of 8 provincial and regional councils for international cooperation. They all work very collaboratively. They're committed to global social justice and social change. And the council represents more than 350 diverse civil society organizations from coast to coast in the country. Jesse and myself and our firm actually had the pleasure of developing a Canada-wide training on resource mobilization for small, medium-sized organizations through the Spur Change program, which is a GAC-funded initiative that is managed by the Alberta Council for International Cooperation. And so we really had such a great opportunity, a unique opportunity to work with so many of the different councils and sort of meeting so many of the organizations represented by these councils. So yeah, the theme of their annual symposium this year was strength in community collaboration and solidarity. It was structured in terms of having a number of plenary kind of presentations. There were sort of smaller breakout discussions, presentations in the afternoon. And on the sort of the last part of it in the afternoon was a Q&A with Patricia Pena, who is the Assistant Deputy Minister of Partnerships and Innovation Branch at Global Affairs. And I think she shared a really a number of interesting highlights, largely of initiatives that the branch has underway. So one of the things that she referenced, which I think is really interesting, and I really hope we can find some experts to speak to on it, is that they are I think it's the partnerships branch. I wasn't sure if she was speaking for all of Global Affairs Canada or just the partnerships branch. But there is a new public engagement results framework that is underway and is being developed by the department. Public engagement is interesting. It came up quite a bit during the symposium. In this instance, it came up. It was also mentioned that funding had been renewed for ICN's Inspiring Action for Global Citizenship program. This is part of a broader announcement that Minister Sajjan had made, in which the government is committing $23.4 million in funding. This was recently announced to extend programming for Canadian public engagement specifically. So 17.4 million of that was provided to ICN's Inspiring Action for Global Citizenship program. I don't know too much about it. I know that it is very much centered on public engagement with the Canadian public. So there was that also that was mentioned. And in one of the, I had a few obviously like kind of informal conversations. It's always an amazing opportunity to network with so many people working in the industry. And it was funny because I was talking to Susan McGregor, who is, I have a card here actually. She is the program coordinator for the International Development Postgraduate program at Humber. Yeah. And so she's, I mean, everyone who works in Canada, like I think has heard of this program, the Humber program. It really is an amazing practical program for those who are interested in international development. So Susan was there and you know, her and I and a few others were having a conversation about how there is less and less of an interest amongst sort of the youth of today in international development work. She's having sort of, like in terms of, I don't know, with Humber specifically, there were a few other representatives from tertiary institutions who manage international development programs. And they were saying the same thing, that numbers are low in terms of enrollment. And I forget, they're like a social research council. They had presented some initial research, but one of the things they were also talking about was that role of engaging with the youth of today, of, again, public engagement. See, that theme kind of came up again, of engaging with the youth the way that, and yes, they obviously they have their issues, but the We Charity, you know, they did a lot of work in terms of, that was a big piece of what they did, was going to different schools, really getting young kids motivated and interested in sort of global issues. Without that, with them now, you know, no longer operating, you know, it was mentioned that there's a bit of a gap now in terms of that side of public engagement with the Canadian public. So public engagement really just came up quite a bit. So that is underway, the new public engagement results framework. I know that a few organizations, including some that I spoke to at OCIC, have mentioned that GAC has undergone some consultations with organizations working in the sector who have implemented strong sort of public engagement interventions as part of their programming. They've been consulted to help support in developing this results, public engagement results framework. So it'll be interesting to keep our eyes on that and just sort of maybe hear from those who've been engaged in those consultations. The other thing she had provided an update on, which Partnerships is also managing, is the Grants and Contribution Transformation Initiative. There's a new IT system that is being sort of developed. I'm not sure if it's being rolled out, but it's part of this initiative. The other update she shared was that some of you might have received invitations to join or apply for the Interchange program, which is essentially bringing on representatives from NGOs and nonprofits to essentially be hired as government employees, I think it was for a year or so, to help support this initiative and to be consulted and help kind of inform the development and the rollout of this initiative. So um, that process has finished. They've hired their employees, so they are already set up and working at GAC, which is interesting. Um, I talked about the Inspiring Action for Global Citizenship program that received additional funding, um, and then the Indo-Pacific call for proposals. She also made reference to. Um, she spoke very high level about GAC's continued interest in localization. She mentioned that GAC is actually starting to be very intentional about when they assess proposals, assessing from a localization lens, which I thought was very interesting. And in fact, I raised my hand to ask her, is there criteria that you have developed on this that you're using, that you're referencing when you're reviewing proposals? And I have to go back to my notes because I remember there wasn't a clear criteria that she stated, but she did give sort of a few kind of hints, I guess, at what they look at.
That's so interesting because, I don't think they've really developed a clear criteria. I mean, they've certainly said, it's been, I think it's been about, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years now that we've been seeing this conversation and this requirement from GAC around, including local partners and wanting to look at what that looks like and being more deliberate about making sure that that's happening, which I think will be really interesting to see how that also unfolds further with the transformation program that's underway. Because, and this is not a new opinion for me, but I've expressed this many times, that I think that one of the big challenges for global affairs in terms of implementing more of a localization agenda is a lot of the administrative processes they have create a large burden for organizations, and can mean that it can be very difficult for smaller local organizations to manage the requirements that are part of GAC funding. So it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of that as well.
Yeah. She had mentioned, and I've been looking for this, researching it, that there is a localization statement that's been signed by GAC. I don't know quite what she was referring to, so I'm trying to find that and sort of read that. The other sort of two kind of broad criteria that she referenced when it comes to looking at proposals from a localization lens was, first off, do you demonstrate a long-standing relationship with communities or with partners, with local partners? She said that that's something that's very easy to measure and to assess, and they see that as sort of a sign of a commitment to localization. The other sort of broader category she talked about was structural indicators. So where does your leadership sit? Who's making those like strategic decisions? That's how I interpreted that particular. So not a ton, honestly, but interesting that they are starting to look at it a little more critically. And also just localization, it came up. I would say it was also a very like prevalent theme throughout the entire event. When you think about like what the theme was of the symposium, strength in community collaboration and solidarity. Of course, it's also one of those discussions. It's one of the very most like contemporary discussions about within our sector is localization, right? So there was a little bit kind of that was touched on when it comes to localization. But yeah, I think things that we've largely heard and largely have sort of discussed before. I wouldn't say there's any sort of new frameworks or like new, commitments that have been made. There was research that was presented by the social science, I think they're called the Social Science Research Council. They did talk a little bit about localization, new research that talks about it, about how NGOs are practicing localization. And they talked a little bit about how they're seeing sort of three main categories of localization: um, ambiguous, basic, and transformative. Um, in terms of the research that they
Interesting.
did, yeah, so there's
Yeah.
a bit of like they're starting to see a bit of I guess a spectrum, or they saw a bit of a spectrum
Yeah.
in their research. Um, so
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's worth trying to, again, I'm trying to pin down that research. I don't know if it's been published yet or if it's going to be newly published, but something else to kind of look out for.
No, that's yeah, and I mean, it's such an important ongoing conversation in the sector. I was thinking as you were saying earlier about the lack of, or at least decreasing youth engagement
Yeah.
with international development work, and the extent to which that's reflective of the kind of discussions that have taken place around colonialism, decolonization, localization, and some of the values that this sort of coming generation might hold. Perhaps that's a little bit optimistic of me, but I actually think that could be, really people are starting to really interrogating a lot more. What is the role of, northern organizations, based organizations in international development? Do we have a role to play, and to what extent is our role just reproducing, dynamics like white saviorism and colonialism? And I think that there is a degree to which that conversation has moved on a lot further with the younger generation, at least from what I'm seeing. And I do have a bias because I have teenagers who are being raised with certain perspectives, but I think it's interesting to reflect on how much that might be impacting. And I think also there's that growing sense too that, I mean, with I think you can't underscore enough also the awareness around climate change and the current ongoing and expanding impact of climate change on everyone's day-to-day lives, and how people, I think, are seeing, especially young people, seeing that as kind of the problem of their generation, the issue to address, and maybe not seeing traditional development as the way to be doing that. I don't know. Anyway, fascinating topic to consider. And I think we'll keep on watching. We've seen a little bit emerge now, I think, from GAC, as far as a bit of news about the Transformation Initiative and what's been happening, and maybe some initial thinking. But we'll continue to track that very closely ourselves as well, and share with you any updates we might get. And it'll be quite exciting, I think, to see what impact that conversation is going to have on Canada's international development sector. So, I think we can maybe wrap up for now. Diana, do you have anything else you wanted to add about anything you saw at OCIC, or any other topics you wanted to touch on during today's conversation?
No, I think that those were the key takeaways that I wanted to share on both topics. That's
great. Well, I really appreciate it also, because I wasn't able to attend, so it's great to have this comprehensive overview, and it sounds like there were some important conversations taking place there. I do want to just highlight as well one more time, we are going to be launching a new course fairly soon that's going to be focusing on Global Affairs Canada specifically, for organizations who work with Global Affairs Canada and want to learn more about how decisions are made internally, kind of demystifying some of the less transparent aspects of global affairs based on our own research and experience. And so look for that. We're going to be launching that very soon, probably at the latest by next week or so. And if you're interested in joining us, it's going to be a lot of fun, this course, and I think share a lot of interesting information. So thanks again, Diana, for joining me today, and thanks everyone for tuning in. And stay tuned. Next week I have a guest joining me who has a lot of grant writing experience in Canada, working with different small nonprofits, and is going to be sharing some of that experience with us, and we're going to be reflecting on some of the trends in government grants in recent years. And that's going to be Kim Peterson. So thanks so much, and we'll look forward to speaking again next week. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.